They laughed at her accent before they realized it was the only reason the patient was still alive. Not loudly at first. That would have been too obvious, too crude for a modern emergency room where prejudice had learned to wear cleaner clothes. No, it started the way these things often start in professional spaces, full of exhausted people and inflated egos, with a look, a smirk, a repeated phrase delivered back to her in imitation, just soft enough that the speaker could later call it harmless. "Can you say that again, doctor?" Kevin Mallory asked, not because he had not understood her, but because two residents standing near the nurse's station had already started smiling. "I missed it through the accent." One of them laughed into his coffee. The other looked down too late. Across the trauma bay, Nurse Adana Okoye stood with a chart in one hand and a blood pressure cuff looped over the other wrist, feeling the old familiar stillness move through her spine. She had worked in emergency medicine long enough to know exactly what kind of moment this was. The white doctor wanted an audience. The white residents wanted permission. The room wanted to decide whether the black nurse with the Nigerian accent was merely competent enough to follow instructions or irritating enough to mock until she became smaller. What none of them knew yet was that 23 minutes later, the chief trauma surgeon would storm into Bay 6, hear the patient's crashing vitals, and ask a question that would shut the whole ER down. "Who caught the internal bleed?" And when the answer came back, not from a resident, not from Mallory, but from the nurse they had just humiliated, nobody in that room would find her accent difficult to understand anymore. St. Catherine's Medical Center sat in the center of downtown Baltimore, like a building permanently braced for impact. Ambulances screamed into the bay at all hours. Security guards drank bad coffee under fluorescent lights at 3 in the morning. The ER never really slept. It only changed temperatures. By 10 p.m., on a Friday, it ran on adrenaline, protocol, and whatever scraps of emotional discipline the staff had left after 12 or 14 hours of triage, blood, paperwork, and grief. It was not a place that rewarded fragility. It also was not a place immune to hierarchy. In a hospital, authority has its own accent, and people who speak it fluently are often forgiven for things that would get others labeled difficult. Adana Okoye had been at St. Catherine's for 6 years and in nursing for nearly 12. She was 37, black, precise, and the kind of calm that made chaos rearrange itself around her instead of inside her. She had grown up in Enugu, moved to the United States at 21 for nursing school, passed every board examination the first time, and learned within the first month of clinicals that many Americans heard intelligence only if it arrived in a familiar voice. Her English was excellent. Her charting was exact. Her medication math was flawless. Still, patients sometimes asked where she was really from, halfway through describing their pain. Doctors who mispronounced pharmacology terms with full confidence would ask her to repeat simple observations. New residents occasionally mistook her accent for uncertainty right until a code blue began, and they discovered she was the steadiest person in the room. She had long ago stopped trying to sand down her voice for other people's comfort. Her father, a physics teacher with permanent chalk in the lines of his fingers, used to tell her, "If they can learn Latin names for bones, they can learn the shape of your English." She carried that sentence with her on difficult days. On very difficult days, she held it like armor. That Friday had been difficult before Kevin Mallory ever opened his mouth. 2 pediatric fevers backed up in triage, 1 opioid overdose revived in room 3, a combative intoxication case in hall bed C, a chest pain workup that looked wrong in a way the monitors had not admitted yet. Adana had taken 1 meal break in name only, standing over yogurt she never opened while charting a difficult transfer. By 9:40 p.m., she was in Bay 6 with a patient named Luis Martinez, a 48-year-old delivery driver who had come in after a low-speed collision at an intersection. Seatbelt on, airbag deployed. Initial scans clear enough to reassure a lazy team, bruising across the abdomen, complaints of shoulder pain and dizziness, vitals not catastrophic. On paper, he looked stable enough for observation and discharge if the repeat labs behaved. Adana did not trust paper when bodies were still telling stories. Luis's pressure had drifted twice in 40 minutes. Not enough for panic, enough for attention. His skin looked a shade grayer than when he arrived. He kept pressing one hand against the left side of his abdomen, not like someone with muscular soreness, but like someone trying instinctively to hold something in place. Adana had seen hidden bleeds before. They announce themselves in whispers until the room is too arrogant to hear whispers, and then they become alarms. Dr. Kevin Mallory was the attending assigned to that zone overnight. White, 45, handsome in the brittle, well-preserved way some men remain handsome only because their self-regard does half the work. He was board-certified, quick on his feet, and widely respected by administrators for keeping throughput numbers high. Nurses described him differently when administrators were not listening. Fast when he should be careful, charming when he was winning, condescending when corrected. He had a habit of treating nursing intuition as valuable only after a physician rephrased it. Younger white male residents adored him because he moved through the ER like confidence was a treatment protocol. He had also never liked being corrected by Adana. Maybe because she did it rarely and only when necessary, which made it harder to dismiss as emotionality. Maybe because she did not decorate her warnings with apology. Maybe because in rooms where he expected easy deference, her competence felt to him like resistance. At 9:47, she approached the central station with Luis's updated vitals and said, "His blood pressure is drifting again. 102/60, then 98/58. Belly is more rigid. I think we need repeat imaging now." Mallory did not look up immediately from the chart he was reviewing with two residents. He had a clean fast. 45 minutes ago, he scribbled something on the page. Then monitor him. Adana stayed where she was. He is being monitored. I am telling you the trend is changing. One resident, a blond young man named Eric, glanced sideways with the uncomfortable interest of somebody who could feel tension but had not yet decided whether it was safe to enjoy it. The second, a white woman named Dana, kept her face carefully blank. Mallory finally looked up. "What exactly is the emergency?" Adana held out the chart. "Pressure drift, worsening guarding, increased pallor, new diaphoresis." He took the chart, scanned it, and said, "You always sound more dramatic than the numbers." It was not the first time he had said something like that. Adana replied evenly, "The numbers are moving in the wrong direction." Mallory tilted his head as if listening to a difficult radio frequency. "Can you say that again?" She knew at once from the tiny smile at Eric's mouth what was happening. "Excuse me?" "I missed it through the accent," he said. Eric laughed into his coffee before catching himself. Dana looked down at the counter too quickly. Across the pod, another nurse stiffened but did not speak. Hospitals are full of witnesses who have learned the cost of becoming participants. Adana felt heat rise behind her eyes, not from shame, but from the effort of containing fury in a workplace that punishes black women twice. Once for being insulted, once for reacting accurately to the insult. "My accent did not interfere with the blood pressure," she said. Mallory smiled. "There's that tone." "No," she replied. "There is concern." He looked back down at the chart in dismissal. "Order another CBC. We'll see what the hemoglobin says." "It will trail the bleed." He sighed audibly. "Nurse Okoye, if every bruise with anxiety got a CT because you had a feeling, this department would collapse." There are moments when a room makes a choice, not officially, not in policy language, just socially in the posture of people who look away rather than interrupt power being ugly. Bay 6 made that choice then. And because Adana had already lived long enough in institutions to know exactly what that meant, she made one too. She walked back to Luis's bay and trusted her patient instead of the doctor. Luis was breathing faster now, trying not to. "Says the pain is worse," she whispered. "Says the pain is worse," she whispered when Adana came in. "And he feels cold?" Adana checked his belly again. Firmer, more tender. She looked at the monitor. Heart rate creeping higher. Not dramatic. Dangerous precisely because it was pretending not to be. She paged for stat labs anyway. Then she did something Mallory would later describe as overstepping, and everyone else would later describe as life-saving. She called trauma surgery for a curbside consult under the hospital's nurse-initiated escalation rule, a rarely used pathway designed exactly for moments when bedside deterioration outran physician comfort. Most staff avoided it because attendings hated being bypassed. Adana used it once in 3 years. That was how serious she was. The surgical fellow on call was tied up upstairs, but the trauma chief, Dr. Elena Strauss, happened to be back in the department after a late OR case, and told Adana to hold the line while she came down herself. Before Strauss arrived, Luis crashed. Not fully. Not movie style. Realer than that. His pressure dropped into the 80s. His skin went waxy. He vomited once. The monitor alarm sharpened, and the whole bay shifted from tense to urgent. Dana was the first resident through the curtain. Eric behind her. Mallory came last, irritated by the sound before he was alarmed by the numbers. What happened? Adana was already spiking fluids. Same thing I told you was happening. Mallory leaned over the patient, finally seeing what her voice had been carrying for the last 20 minutes. Get repeat fast. Now? Portable ultrasound is 2 bays down, Dana said. Mallory snapped for blood, for transport, for someone to call radiology as though urgency invented late was the same as urgency honored early. Then Dr. Elena Strauss entered. She was white, 52, compact, severe, and widely feared in the mild, healthy way surgeons should be feared by people who enjoy sloppy thinking. She came through the curtain like purpose in human form, one hand still gloved from peeling out of another case. Her eyes moved from the monitor to the patient to the room with terrifying speed. What's the story? Nobody answered fast enough. Adana did. Restrained driver, low speed MVC, initial fast negative, abdominal ecchymosis, progressive hypotension, worsening guarding, pallor, diaphoresis. I escalated for internal bleed concern 23 minutes ago. Strauss looked at Luis once, put her hand on his abdomen, and her whole face changed. Who caught the internal bleed? Again, the room made a choice. Dana looked at Adana. Eric looked at the floor. Mallory hesitated. Adana did not speak because she had not asked the question. She had answered it already. It was Nurse Okoye, Dana said quietly. Strauss turned sharply. And when did she raise it? Nobody should ever have to answer a question like that in front of a surgeon with failing vital signs screaming behind it. Mallory knew it. The residents knew it. Adana knew it most of all. Still the answer came. About 20 minutes ago, Dana said. Strauss looked at Mallory with a level of contempt so clean it almost clarified the air. And you're just now calling it? He tried the usual. Initial imaging, reassuring labs, evolving presentation. Strauss cut straight through all of it. Take him to CT if he'll hold. If he drops another point, we go straight upstairs. Massive transfusion standby. Move. The bay erupted in real motion then. Not panic. Proper speed. Luis's wife was pulled gently aside and told what they feared. Blood orders were pushed. Transport materialized. Someone nearly collided with a crash cart at the curtain. Through all of it, Strauss stepped once back toward Adana and said, low enough for the room, but not the corridor. Good catch. That was the first clean respect anybody had offered all night. Luis made it to CT by a margin thinner than Mallory's pride deserved. Splenic bleed, active extravasation, internal blood loss worse than the first exam had shown. He was in the OR within 28 minutes and out alive just after midnight. In medicine, people talk a lot about near misses. What they mean is, we almost buried someone because arrogance and inertia dressed themselves as judgment. The first fallout came quietly. At 11:13, while the department was still running hot and gossip moved in whispers between charting stations, Eric approached Adana by the medroom and said, I'm sorry I laughed. She looked at him, not unkindly, just tired. Then remember how easy it was. He went red. That was something at least. Dana came later with 2 cups of Bad Machine coffee and placed one beside Adana's computer without ceremony. For the record, she said, you were right before any of us were brave. Adana almost smiled. That's not the best review I've ever had. Dana looked toward the trauma board. It's the truest one tonight. Mallory avoided her until 1:30 a.m., which in a hospital is practically emotional sprinting. He found her finally by the supply alcove while she was restocking gauze. No audience now. Of course not. Men like him rarely apologize in the rooms where they perform disrespect. They prefer side corridors where shame can pretend to be private. Nurse Okoye, he began. She kept counting saline flushes. Yes, doctor. He cleared his throat. Your assessment on Martinez was correct. She waited. And my comments earlier were inappropriate. There were 100 ways she could have answered. None of them would have repaired the deeper thing. She set the box down and looked at him. You mocked how I speak while I was trying to save your patient time? His face tightened because specifics are harder to survive than abstractions. Yes, you did it in front of residents. Yes. And if Dr. Strauss hadn't come down when she did? He said nothing, because silence was the only honest answer. Adana nodded once. Then let that sit with you longer than this apology. She walked away before he could borrow forgiveness he had not earned. By morning, the story had moved through St. Catherine's in the coded, efficient bloodstream of hospitals. Not the ugly version exactly. Those always get softened in official retellings. But enough. Nurse catches hidden bleed. Trauma chief tears into attending. The Nigerian nurse in Base 6 saved the guy everybody thought was stable. The details sharpened depending on who was telling it. In some versions, Strauss humiliated Mallory in front of the whole pod, which was not quite true. In others, Adana had diagnosed the splenic bleed by instinct alone, which gave too much credit to mystique and not enough to training. What mattered more was that people said her name now with a slightly different awareness. Not because she had changed, because the room had been forced to. The official version arrived 3 days later. Saint. Occult internal hemorrhage. The email occult internal hemorrhage. The email named Adana Okoya directly and copied senior leadership. It also announced a review of physician-nurse escalation response in the ER and a mandatory refresher on respectful interdisciplinary communication. Hospitals love broad language when specific guilt threatens to stain someone with status. Adana read the email on her lunch break, snorted once at the phrase interdisciplinary communication, and went back to eating plantain from a container her sister had packed because institutional language never fed anybody. What surprised her more was Dr. Strauss. A week after the incident, the surgeon found her in the staff elevator between shifts and said, "You ever consider advanced trauma certification?" Adana glanced sideways. "Sometimes." Strauss nodded. "You should stop considering and do it." That was it. No excessive praise, no sentimental speech. Coming from Elena Strauss, it felt more valuable than half the awards on the hospital wall. At home that Friday, Adana told the story to her older brother Cheek over speakerphone while chopping onions in her kitchen. He lived in Houston, sold industrial equipment, and had the family gift for sounding amused and furious at the same time. When she finished, he said, "So they mocked your accent in the emergency room until your accent became the reason a man saw sunrise. That is one version. It is the correct version." She laughed then, really laughed, the kind that loosens a week's worth of held muscle. Her mother called the next day from Lagos and listened in perfect outraged silence before saying, "You see, this is why you will never twist your tongue for anybody. Let fools educate themselves." That made Adana laugh harder. But later, lying in bed after a double shift, she thought about Luis's wife gripping that purse in Base 6 and how close the room had come to failing them both because the wrong kind of confidence is still often treated as leadership in hospitals. She thought about how many black nurses, immigrant nurses, accented nurses had been told to repeat themselves by people who understood them the first time just fine. And she thought about the part no commendation email could capture, that what happened to her in that ER had not been exceptional. The save was exceptional. The disrespect was ordinary. That was what made it dangerous. 2 months later, St. Catherine's hosted a simulation training for new residents. Adana was asked to lead one of the trauma response stations, a decision that quietly irritated 2 people and delighted several others. Midway through the session, one nervous intern stumbled over her name, apologized, and said, "I hope I understand you correctly under pressure." The room held its breath by instinct, maybe because stories travel. Adana looked at him and said, not unkindly, "Under pressure, doctor, the question is usually whether you understand the patient in time. Start there." The residents laughed, but respectfully. The lesson landed. By winter, Luis Martinez had come back to the ER not as a patient, but carrying a bakery box and a slightly crooked smile. He asked for the nurse who knew something was wrong when everyone else thought I just needed fluids. Adana met him in the family consult room because hospital policy frowned on gifts and sentiment in equal measure. He thanked her in Spanish first, then in English because gratitude often wants more than one language if it can find it. His wife cried. Adana accepted one pastry for the whole unit and wrote nothing dramatic about it in the chart because charts are for facts, not poetry. Still, as she walked back to the desk with powdered sugar on one glove, Dana called after her, "Hey, internal bleed catcher." Adana turned. "That better not become my nickname." Eric from the next pod said, "Too late." She rolled her eyes, but smiling this time. And maybe that was the closest thing to a good ending these stories ever get. Not that prejudice vanished. It didn't. Not that one email fixed a culture. It won't. But a black nurse with an accent was mocked in the ER while trying to warn a doctor that a man was bleeding where nobody could yet see it. She kept speaking anyway. Then the surgeon asked who caught the internal bleed, and the whole room had to answer with her name. Not because her accent suddenly became clear, because it had always been clear to anyone actually listening.